I'd like to invite Cristiano Amon, the president of Qualcomm, Peggy Johnson, the executive vice president of business development at Microsoft, and Urs Schaeppi, the CEO of Swisscom, to come join us up here on stage in these very comfortable couches.
Yeah, they're not comfortable.
Urs, you know, we're on your home territory here, so let's start with you. Tell us where you are here in Switzerland in the 5G rollout.
Yeah, in 2018, we built up several pilot networks. We are a customer of Ericsson, and our strategy is to have a technology leadership strategy. That's why we made some pilots, some small villages to test the performance of fixed wireless access. And then we have another city where we made live pilots with devices, the first devices. So I think 5G is a promising technology which is coming.
What have you learned? How are people in these villages doing different things, reacting with their phones differently?
No, there are still up to now small pilots because the handsets are not here. They will come let's say in the middle of this year or the first ones, and then it will take time. The majority will be in 2020. So it will take time, but our ambition is to have a rollout in 60 cities in 2019 with 5G, and then going in a full rollout in 2020.
Okay. Peggy, Microsoft sadly no longer has a handset business, but I would imagine you're doing lots of things to support and extend the 5G standard. So talk about what you guys are doing.
So we're okay with that. It's a tough business. So, I mean, basically our interest in it is our customers' interest. So we have enterprise customers for the last 40-some plus years in Microsoft's history, and all of them are going through a digital transformation themselves. And as they go through that transformation, they're looking at, what else can they digitize in their businesses, and how can we help them do that? So we look at it from that perspective. We largely don't make the IoT devices, but we want to power them. We want to bring the power of our cloud all the way out to the very edge, what we call the intelligent edge, all the way back to the intelligent cloud. And that edge is basically the interface of the cloud and these devices that are out there. And so the more compute power that we can bring out there and reliance on these 5G networks, the more scenarios that we can enable for our enterprise customers.
Cristiano, I want to talk about timing. You guys have talked about Q2, Q3, 2019 as the onset to 5G. I've been in this business, long enough to remember the beginning of the 4G wave and the 3G wave, and it always seems like the hype preceded the reality, that the early handsets were kind of bedeviled, by poor battery life and large form factors. What's different this time around?
The main difference, Brad, is we have now a very mature smartphone society. I think, everybody has a smartphone, know what the smartphone can do, you know what your expectations are. So when you think about bringing 5G to a flagship device, the one that's going to be launching, for example, in many geographies in the first half 2019, the customer has an expectation on performance and battery life that you're not going to sell that device if you don't meet or exceed. And I think that's the main difference that we have now. The smartphone was very immature. Still, you have a lot of people with BlackBerries and other devices. The app stores didn't have as many apps. Now, the smartphone is part of everything we do. I think the industry understands that. We understand that. Our partners understand that. And we're excited about what we have seen, the type of devices that are being built for the launch. Some IDs, even with the complexities of 5G, like millimeter wave and multiple antennas, they look very competitive and compelling with the devices we see today.
So Qualcomm sells chips and modems to handset makers. I was talking to Börje about this kind of bifurcated world that we're in thanks to political and trade tensions. Do you guys see that, or is it still, from Qualcomm's perspective, one market?
From a device perspective, and let's just start talking about smartphones. Device perspective is still a global market, and it's becoming more global. If you see, for example, one of the fastest growing industries in China electronics, you look at companies like Xiaomi, Vivo, Oppo, OnePlus, they have seen expanding, and now, for example, going to markets like Europe, the United States. OnePlus recently launched at T-Mobile, and it's a global market. And 5G, because it's once every 10 years, you have a change in the industry. Many OEMs see this as an opportunity to disrupt, do something different, and gain market share. So I think our China business is great.
Okay.
You know, frankly, we don't have any problems in China.
Political tensions, less of a reality for you. Börje and Urs, Europe used to be a leader when it came to mobile technology, and more recently it seemed like the center of gravity shifted to the US and to China. You know, where is Europe competitively when it comes to 5G leadership? Maybe Börje and then Urs.
What you see is really North America leading the way right now, and I would say there you are seeing commercial 5G networks available today, so you can actually use 5G and enjoy that. It's happening very fast in Northeast Asia, talking China, South Korea, Japan, right? That's also powering ahead very fast. Europe as a continent is lagging. There are pockets, and Swisscom is one which really is the world's first actually functioning 5G network with commercial devices and commercial equipment in. So here you would be able to enjoy it as well if you would have the device. So we are seeing parts of Europe, but as a continent, Europe has actually lost out. It's a lot to do with spectrum prices and spectrum availability. It's still, you know, if you look at the spectrum prices in Italy, for example, it was basically 2 years of capex for the industry. So of course it's going to impact the way the European operators invest. You have other regulations related to privacy, net neutrality, etc., which limits the appetite in Europe. And we see Europe now actually being slower, and in many European countries not talking about the 5G network until 2020 or 2021, which from a global perspective is going to be late.
Urs, do you agree with that? Or is Swisscom the exception to the rule in Europe?
I think the markets are very different, and as Börje mentioned, it depends on a lot of factors. But in Switzerland, we have a quite good framework. We have also a regulation which is, I would say, liberal, and infrastructure competition in Switzerland is important. That's why the whole industry is actually pushed to ramp up these networks, and taking the 4G LTE networks. Switzerland has leading networks. We have a coverage in Switzerland of 99%, over 99% 4G coverage, driven actually by this infrastructure competition. And I'm convinced that we will also have a leading position on 5G. Just as an example, all our base stations are connected today with fiber. In a lot of countries, the majority of the base stations, they are not connected with fiber. So they have to ramp up all the fiber networks. But I think collaboration is extremely important in such a case. We work very close with Ericsson to be leading on this topic.
Have you acquired the spectrum that you need for the network rollout?
No, we will acquire it at the end of this month.
Okay, and as Börje was saying, is it comparatively expensive?
I can't say you can ask me in 4 weeks.
Okay. Peggy, let's talk about applications.
Yeah.
Right, 10x the speed of 4G. And maybe we can start with enterprise, and then we can all talk about consumer applications. What in this coming world, maybe the second quarter of this year, maybe next year, what will be different?
Well, I mean, a couple that are rising up that we see are the idea of empowering first-line workers. So these are the people behind the desks that working in hospitals. For many companies, they're the first employee that people see of that company. And oftentimes they don't have a PC. And so now what we think we will see more of is an empowerment of those workers with intelligence all the way out to wherever they are. And there's a lot of excitement around that. One of the applications that we're involved in, and actually a device that we do make, is the HoloLens. And if you can imagine, the HoloLens is something like a computer on your eyes. And so we have field operations folks who would like to wear that while they're out in the field. For instance, at ThyssenKrupp, the elevator repair people have been hauling along a PC and then looking at the elevator and turning around and pulling up a picture on the PC. Now they can just put the HoloLens on their eyes, look at the elevator, and we can put metadata on top of it and sort of talk them through repair of the elevator, or someone remotely can talk them through that. So we see a lot of interest in things like that. Chevron is doing something with oil refineries and HoloLens, where they have a handful of highly trained technicians that just can't be in all places at one time. You can put a field technician equipped with HoloLens out at one of their oil refineries, and they can go in, view what the problem is, and a technician a couple thousand miles away can be giving them feedback and guidance. So those are the sorts of things we're seeing from an enterprise perspective.
I was on campus a couple of weeks ago,
right?
And we got a little sneak peek of the HoloLens 2, which is absolutely remarkable, and improves the display size, and it's lightweight, and I was wondering, to what extent was the latency issue on the 4G networks an impediment to the first HoloLens, and how much does 5G solve the latency issue for someone who, it might be a high bandwidth application out in the field?
Right, so a lot of that is video, and as video is getting transferred back and forth, and you want to make a real split-second decision, obviously latency becomes super important. Or if an alert pops up and an employee with the HoloLens looks at it, you want to be able to fix that as quickly as possible. So it is very important, particularly in places like oil refineries. You want to ensure that you can get to the problem and fix the problem as quickly as possible. And you need the high bandwidth for sending back and forth all of the video and running computer vision on it and looking at your data bank of pictures and images and ensuring that, there is a problem here because it doesn't line up with what it's supposed to look like. And you want to be doing that very, very quickly.
Cristiano, we could probably list the companies that would not have been possible without 4G, right? Arguably, Uber doesn't exist without 4G, many of the other ride-sharing companies. So what kinds of entrepreneurship become possible with 5G?
Well, the beauty of those new generations of wireless, we're developing the technology, and it's supposed to last a decade. So some we have visibility now, some are yet to be invented. Now, what we see, however, is there are a couple of hints with the technology that give you an insight of what type of business model you can have. You should think about 5G, whether it's an industrial device or consumer device, you have a very high bandwidth and you have instant response time. So you can use that not only to change the services. For example, from a consumer perspective, today we stream music with 4G everywhere. So now people don't download music anymore, just stream it. We take that for granted. In any signal conditions, video is going to be like that with 5G. But then social today, we have your friends, whether Facebook, Instagram, and you go see their posts. With 5G and the latency, live presence, what your friends are doing and what they're broadcasting, what they're doing at that time, becomes an easier to do, more common, so you're going to have an evolution of social. We see a lot of activities from the social companies, probably ahead of other companies developing applications for consumers. Then you keep going. If you look at gaming, for example, if you look at 5G as a link, a very high-speed link, we had this demonstration we done at Qualcomm. We got a smartphone with your smartphone processor. We put a $10,000 gaming PC, top-of-the-line gaming PC, on the other side of the 5G link. When you run the game workload, you do a lot of the computation and rendering in the computer, and you get it back in your screen. So you're starting to see the ability to have unlimited computing relying on computation from the edge per different use cases. So you can see the potential that you have now to have your smartphone or your industrial device to have computation on demand. And those are just the beginning of many of the transformations we're going to see with 5G.
Does this supplant the need for people to set up Wi-Fi networks in their home?
Look, I'm a big believer in conversions. One thing that we're starting to see on Wi-Fi today, one of the biggest success we had in our Wi-Fi business at Qualcomm in the year of 18 was a Wi-Fi mesh. Because for the first time, I think the carriers are starting to understand that even the fixed broadband, they are in the wireless business. Because you have mobile devices, you expect Wi-Fi to work in every corner of your home. And that's how Wi-Fi mesh. I believe we're going to see full convergence of those networks in 5G, and hopefully you're going to have not only Wi-Fi, but 5G in your home as well.
But it's interesting when you think about new applications, and we often talk about that, right? And one thing what does it mean with low latency from a consumer point of view? What it means is you can get instant feedback. So imagine that you put on your glove, so you go e-shopping, and you can feel the fabric. And you can feel if the avocado is ripe or not, right? Because you get instantaneous feedback. It's going to change the way we shop. It's going to change not only gaming, so to say, or video streaming. It's so many applications that I think our own mind will actually limit us. So it's not until you have the networks and the infrastructure that those will come. That's back to this question you asked earlier, right? Why is this a national resource? Yeah, because they are going to drive innovation based on top of these networks.
I've always thought of bandwidth like a highway, or I've heard it described as a highway, a congested highway, and you add 2 more lanes and more traffic comes, and it's still congested. I mean, what is to say that the next generation applications that are being optimized for 5G don't replicate the glut that we see today, and once again, latency creeps back up, and we're all watching the spinning wheel of delay on our phones?
The way the architecture is built in 5G, I mean, you can always argue, I guess you would run into some capacity limitations, but it's going to be at such a much higher bar that you will not see that.
Urs, are there applications that you're excited about on your network for 5G?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of applications, as already explained, in the B2C market. But the big potential is also in the B2B market. The whole IoT, smart homes, smart cars, everything with smart. And then Industry 4.0 application, these campus networks. We had a pilot with a customer here in Switzerland, and he built his own connectivity in his fabric on a 5G network. So you can totally change actually your way how you produce.
Sorry, this was like a clothier?
That's instead of having a fiber network in your company, you have the connectivity on 5G.
Okay.
And with the low latency, with cloud, you are really powerful on it.
No one has yet mentioned autonomy or autonomous vehicles. Obviously, a lot needs to happen on the AI side, but what kind of a boost is a 5G network?
Maybe I'll try.
Go for
it. At CES, I think was the first time we show what we're doing in highway autopilot for the automotive. And we are a believer that when you look at things happening in the automotive sector, like cellular V2X, vehicle to vehicle, vehicle to infrastructure, you are going to achieve that with a combination of processing AI, but also connectivity and 5G. And you can start to think about when the cars are connecting to each other, connecting to the cloud. When you think of something as simple as looking at your navigation map, every one of us with a smartphone and every other car in the street, it's a proxy of where we are. You can have a live map with location of every pedestrian. every car in the road, don't leave your phone at home, of course. And that it has a huge implication how you think about autonomous system, traffic management, and safety. So we see, I think, as we discussed earlier, the B2B application, the safety application in automobile, and then overall smart city becomes a big topic for 5G as well.
I mean,
maybe one remark. It's always chicken and egg problem here. Huh? And I remember myself very well when we ramped up the 3G networks. Huh? A lot of journalists were coming and they tell me we don't need 3G. Huh? Without 3G, we wouldn't have today's smartphones. And in this time, nobody talked about smartphones. And I think we will have exactly the same phenomena also with 5G. There will come a lot of new application. It will change our business models. And that's why we have to ramp up the network. And then on this, we can create ecosystems.
I am fond and nostalgic for my flip phone. But Peggy, you were going to jump in.
Yeah, well, you had said autonomous vehicles, but there's also autonomous devices like robots. And we have an investment in a small company in Seattle called Sarcos. And they have an exoskeleton robot, and they also have something called the Guardian S. It's a snake that's sent into environments, maybe a nuclear disaster, and you don't want to send people in, you can send this thing in. And that thing is just bristling with sensors, right? So you want to be able to take in all the images very quickly, process the images, and do something, flip a switch, because this snake can go up walls and it can actually turn switches off and on. And so that's what 5G will enable, things like that, where very quickly you've got to bring in a bunch of images, get with the high bandwidth, and do something with very, very low latency.
I'm going to open this up to questions in a couple of minutes, so start thinking of questions for our panelists. Cristiano, though, I can't not ask about Apple, the Qualcomm-Apple relationship. Obviously very complicated. I know that there is an FTC case where you testified that you can't talk about, so we'll steer clear of that. But let me ask you, I mean, is that relationship broken? I mean, can we see a 5G future where Apple is still using Qualcomm chips or Qualcomm modems?
Nice to see you too, Brett. Look, it is a complex relationship. I think at the end of the day, I think Qualcomm is basically fighting for the rights of our intellectual property. And we, our companies like Qualcomm, like Ericsson, have been, and many others, been investing in technology. And the beauty of, I think, our licensing model, Ericsson license model, you don't have to build a Qualcomm or Ericsson to participate in the cellular industry. Anybody can come in and be a leader. And I think that's the essence of the fight. At the end of the day, we are very focused, and because that's what we do for a living, in bringing new wireless technology and bringing 5G. We think it's going to be transformative, and we think that I can't really speak for Apple, but any company that wants to be a leader in the industry and will continue to innovate needs to work with the leaders, and we're going to continue to work very hard to be the leader that we are right now in technology. If that happens, there's always a bright future ahead of us.
Okay.
It's as good as I can
Börje
get.
wants to weigh in on this.
I was going to say not, but I think it's one of the important factors for the success of the mobile industry is actually the licensing model. So anyone can actually start a company leveraging the latest technology and launch a product. You need to sign up a couple of licenses, but it's relatively straightforward. That's very few industries that can do that. So in a way, we have created a very good, call it kind of ecosystem for innovation and actually competition.
Where some cracks are appearing, but perhaps not irrevocably so. Let me ask you, and Urs, maybe you could start on this one. The deployment of previous generations of mobile technology have been unevenly distributed, right? Cities before rural areas, wealthy neighborhoods before poorer ones. What can we do this time around to be a little bit more equitable as 5G rolls out?
I think it's also strongly dependent on the competitive situation in a country. I'm convinced in Switzerland we will have a fast rollout of 5G because of the competition. If you are financially stretched, that's another topic. So we will have the networks first in the cities. But then long term, they will be also in rural areas, I'm convinced. Because, you know, today, who wants to be on 2G? Nobody, huh?
I think my dad still has his old 2G phone. Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
I would say, you know, the opportunity, you brought up gaming earlier. So there's 2 billion gamers in the world, and we make the Xbox console. We'd like to sell consoles to everybody in that 2 billion. That's just not possible. But 5G is going to enable that. So we are moving to cloud gaming. Last year we talked about Project xCloud to move gaming into the cloud. It's wholly dependent on 5G. That's how it'll be enabled. And we can bring the fun and the excitement of e-games to the 2 billion gamers out there now with small, lightweight devices. And so it'll enable, that's the sort of enablement I think you'll see when we have 5G networks up and running.
I was going to say that I think now we focus on 5G as kind of the panel here, but the reality is we have a bigger challenge to bridge the digital divide globally, right? Large parts of the world are still covered in 2G. Some would have 3G, a little bit more, right? But we need to, if we're serious about bridging that divide, we need to create an environment for investments in infrastructure in those countries as well. So it's not, if we get 5G a little bit later on the countryside in Sweden, that's fine, to be honest. But I think there is a bigger connectivity question that needs to be resolved.
Has government done enough to address that?
I mean, it still exists. So I guess the answer then, more has to be done.
If I may offer like a glass half full when we look at 5G versus the other Gs. Usually the challenge in less populated areas or in the rural areas is you have the economics to actually build the infrastructure. One good thing we're seeing about 5G, I think we discussed in this panel, in addition to the consumer broadband, you have a lot of industrial cases. There's a lot of agriculture cases with 5G connected drones and things like that. So as you started to have other industry participating in the mobile value chain, you just have a different economic equation, a business model that make the deployment of infrastructure more attractive than before. The other element is you have with the factory, the enterprise, like one of the things we're able to achieve with 5G, we'll be able to get industrial Ethernet performance with 5 nines of reliability. And that's the comment I think you made about factories being rewired for 5G. So as you get that, the network will densify faster because you have enterprises densifying the network together with the operator. So that's why we may have a different equation than we have on the past that may more optimistic about the speed of rollout.
On this digital divide, which Börje mentioned, I think there are 2 factors which are important. The one is the responsibility of the regulator. I think Europe has not a very good environment for investments. We actually destroy the market only through price regulation, so no incentive to invest. So I think a regulator must be prudent there. And the second thing is, I'm convinced if you have a good competition, we will also have a good coverage of 5G in rural areas because customers are demanding it. Huh? Gaming and all this.
And you know, you look at what's going. It's interesting to look at the US, not necessarily from other reasons than what goes on in 5G right now. The rest can be entertaining, I guess. But if you look at 5G, what's happening? We see the FCC has made a couple of very important rulings, right? One is related to net neutrality, which in a 5G world is going to be, with network slicing, the old definition of net neutrality would actually impede rollout of new services. They have made rulings on easier permitting processes, for example, some other regulations, and all of this serves the purpose of creating a better regulatory environment for a faster rollout. In Europe, we're not seeing any of those movements. We're rather seeing a system that prides itself by being world leader in regulation. And I don't think that's going to help a fast rollout of 5G. Just like Urs said here in Switzerland, it's actually, in that sense, a favorable environment for
I just want to understand, you said that the net neutrality ruling will stymie investment in 5G in the US?
Not the way it's defined now. I lift the old definition. If the old definition would be, then you would struggle to prioritize traffic. There are going to be certain critical applications which you can't interfere with, right? So if, take an extreme case, I do my surgery, it's a remote surgery, and there is a kid loading a movie down by the street, and all of a sudden my robot stops. I'm not sure I would be very happy about that.
The patient will not be happy, for sure.
So that's why you need to actually start to define traffic differently. Not all traffic is created equal.
Okay, I want to open up the opportunity to ask questions of our panelists. We have some roving microphones. Yes, sir.
It's exciting to hear about 5G for growth, but so many of the themes here in Davos are about sustainability, equality, but also how to make the world a better place. I'm just wondering if, from the panel, the applications that we're thinking about 5G for good. Because once we're starting to see those applications, the same way we've described it in the B2C and the B2B world, then I'm convinced that's going to accelerate the investment, both through corporate and government, in 5G. What thoughts do you have about that?
Maybe
I'll
just volunteer a few. See, when we talk about speed and latency, you started to look at applications, and we briefly mentioned about virtual presence. So, especially with healthcare, the ability to have specialists having access to doctors in the same way they're going to visit their office, from remote locations, or people that will rely on the technology for that. That's one clear benefit of getting people together. There are many others. By basically, with ability of 5G, I know it's a controversial topic, but you can make, when you add the transformation of the manufacturing industry, the advent of 3D printing, plus the remote connectivity, you can democratize manufacturing as well. So you can have many local, geographies and countries participating in manufacturing. So as the technology is used to connect everyone, reducing the distance between people, I think there's going to be a lot of positive things that will come off this platform. And I think we can list them all, but I think we have seen that mobile has been a force for good since the beginning of the 3G, then 4G transformation. So 5G should be the same thing.
But it's really reducing the waste in the economy, right? So you can reduce the waste in logistics chains, in heating of buildings, in the way you do city planning, avoid getting car idling in front of a traffic light, etc. There's where you have big benefits. And when we have done some calculations, we think digital technologies are going to help us solve about a third of the climate goals for 2030. All of that will be enabled by connectivity. So connectivity is going to be critical in helping the economy to actually cope with the climate challenges.
Any other questions for our panel? I just want to push back on that a little bit, because I feel like there are a lot of ways in which our society has not yet adapted to even 4G. So, the congestion in our cities because of the rise of the ride-sharing companies. The opportunities for foreign governments to meddle in social networks when people are spending more and more time online. As any parent knows, the pure addictive possibilities of mobile devices now. I mean, all of these things seem like they have the potential to get even a little bit worse with 5G. Have we caught up to these changes, and do we have the protections in place to kind of protect us from ourselves when we get this new bandwidth?
But can I ask the question to you? So do you use Uber just to roam around? And you just roam around, no destination, no purpose?
That's not a pastime, no.
No, so you use it because you need it to go from one place to another.
Yeah, but at the same time, the city where I live, San Francisco...
It's more efficient.
Well, it was sold as more efficient, and in many ways
But
it
is more efficient.
But the city where I live is absolutely bedeviled by drivers who have flocked in and made getting from point A to point B a lot more difficult. So it gives and it takes.
But how do you think it would have worked if you would have your own car to go from point A to point B?
Well, I mean,
and
I still do
everyone else,
drive.
by the way, would do exactly the same thing.
Yes, okay.
So I think you have to look, that's why it's very hard to say. I don't think traffic has increased. The demand is
there
there.
are studies that say that it has, but we can...
Let's look at those studies,
that. Okay.
because that to me, because that would mean that people roam around. So they just call for an Uber and say, "Oh, take me out for an hour," and I cruise the streets a bit, and then I go back home. That doesn't seem to me to be the most frequent
No, but
use
drivers
of
are coming into major cities from out of town because they see opportunity in
you
finding
don't
a
like
ride.
out-of-towners.
No, I don't, but I'm just saying the infrastructure was not built to support that.
If I could jump in here for a different perspective, just more broadly, I do think we're entering a time when companies have to be much more thoughtful about the technology they release into the wild. And so when it is released, we have to think about those ramifications and any of those side effects and be prepared for them, whether it's reskilling workers or whatever, many of the topics that are here at Davos. So I think, going forward, it's really about working in conjunction with other tech companies, working in conjunction with the governments to ensure that the technology doesn't have harmful side effects, unintended consequences, things like that. Our president, Brad Smith, today is talking about the technology facial recognition and calling for regulation in the industry. We want to ensure that ourselves, others, and governments are in lockstep about how that technology is used. And I think, without that, you have these unintended consequences that even through the good efforts and outcomes that you're hoping for, you don't expect. And so I think those things we need to be thoughtful about those going forward.
To this topic of sustainability, I'm convinced that connectivity is actually a CO2 saver. Because, just taking an example, if I avoid the travel to San Francisco, I save the CO2 for 1 year with my car. So, and there are a lot of new kind of collaboration, remote office work. So I think really it's sustainable. At the end, it will be sustainable.
Okay, we probably have time for one more question, and I think there is one here in the back.
Question? Hi, I'm Haley Edwards. I'm Nation Editor at Time Magazine. I raised my hand before when you were having your discussion about traffic in San Francisco. And I can just say that conversation often happens within this bubble without realizing that in 2005, 2006, getting around the city was so bad that there was a discussion of actually improving public transport, which we have not done. So this is not something that is just one or the other. And I think if the future of 5G means surveillance snakes and more drones, I think we should talk about what this means for the global good. And it's good to hear that is at least coming up in some of these discussions. But I wonder, I think the discussion about being able to to teleport yourself in virtually rather than flying across the country, it's a good example of how to benefit the environment. But I'd be interested to hear from anyone else who has an example of how 5G might help us create a more sustainable world.
Yeah, thank you, Haley. Yeah.
So, it's I think to the question about is 5G, a force for good, and maybe in the prior conversation, I just want to make one observation, because you mentioned, about you can always find things in the technology that probably not how it was intended to be utilized, like with everything, but it's undeniable, I think, the benefits to society of mobile, especially if you look at empowering people, the amount of access to information we have. I think especially in emerging markets has been the first access to computing and the internet, to smartphone. I think what the real issue is, and I'm just not to be controversial, but just one opinion. We are living in a connected world, and more of the data is going to be to the cloud, to the point that the same way that you have your physical self, you're going to have your digital self. So the reality is, in general, what I think we need to evolve how we think about in the society. Like governments protect your physical self, you need to have protection for your digital self. But we are in a connected world, and I think it's going to get more connected, because I think that's what we do as humans. So I think, from my perspective, is we just have to accept that all of us will have a digital self, and we need to be entitled to the same protection we have for our physical being.